The champagne glasses were still clinking when Beatrice Whitmore leaned close to her daughter's ear and hissed the words she had used 1,000 times before. "Stand by the exit. Hold these. And for God's sake, don't let anyone see your face for too long." Valerie didn't argue. She never did. She simply gathered the pile of coats and designer handbags into her arms and walked toward the service door of the Grand Royal Hotel's ballroom, her low heels sinking slightly into the thick red carpet with every step. Tonight was the Whitmore Logistics Charity Gala, an event her family had spent 3 months planning, inviting senators, real estate moguls, and every wealthy face in the city. It was, as her mother liked to say, an important night for important people. Valerie was not important. She had learned that a long time ago. She was 29 years old, and for 31 years, since she was old enough to understand words, her family had called her the same thing, the ugly, obese one. It didn't matter that she had lost weight years ago, that her body had changed more than once through her 20s. The name had stuck like tar. It wasn't really about her body anymore. It was a leash, a way to keep her small. "Oh, don't drop Chloe's Birkin," her sister said, sweeping past in a shimmering emerald gown, not even glancing at Valerie's face. "It costs more than your entire wardrobe." A cluster of women near the champagne fountain laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Enough for Valerie to hear the word obese whispered somewhere in the middle of their giggling, followed by a pitying glance in her direction. She kept her eyes down and her arms full, the strap of a Chanel bag digging into her wrist. She had learned, over the years, exactly how to endure this. Breathe slowly. Count the tiles on the floor. Let the words pass through her like wind through an open window, sharp but temporary. She told herself this every single time. Temporary. What she didn't know was that 30 feet above her, behind a wall of dark one-way glass on the VIP mezzanine, someone else was watching. And for him, tonight would be the last night this ever happened. Gabriel Vance stood with a glass of untouched scotch in his hand, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the small figure near the service exit below. From up here, the gala looked like a painting. Golden light, swirling gowns, easy laughter. But all he could see was Valerie, standing alone with her arms full of other people's belongings while her family paraded around like she didn't exist. 2 years. 2 years of marriage, hidden from the world, hidden even from her own blood. 2 years of watching the woman he loved fold herself smaller and smaller so the people who were supposed to protect her wouldn't feel threatened by her existing at all. "You're gripping that glass hard enough to shatter it," said a voice beside him. Marco Reyes, his chief lieutenant, stepped up next to him, following his gaze down to the ballroom floor. Marco had known Gabriel for 15 years, long enough to recognize the particular stillness that came before Gabriel Vance made a decision that could not be undone. "They called her that name again," Gabriel said quietly, "in front of 200 people." Marco didn't need to ask which name. Everyone in Gabriel's inner circle knew exactly how the Whitmore family treated their youngest daughter, because Gabriel had told them. Once, in a rare moment of fury, 3 months into their secret marriage, after Valerie had cried herself to sleep in his arms, and he'd lain awake until dawn deciding what he was going to do about it. He had promised her patience. He had promised her that the moment would come when she was ready, when the timing was right, when it would hurt her family the most. Tonight, watching Chloe toss her sister a designer bag like she was hired help, Gabriel decided the timing didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that this ended. "Get the legal team on a secure call within the hour," Gabriel said, setting his glass down on the marble railing. "And call our contact at the city permits office. I want to know exactly how fast we can get access to the Apex Tower's exterior lighting grid." Marco raised an eyebrow. "Phase 1? Tonight?" "Tonight," Gabriel confirmed, his voice low and final. "Everything moves. The audit, the accounts, the tower, all of it. I'm done watching her carry other people's coats like she's invisible." Below them, Valerie shifted the weight of the bags in her arms and forced a small, practiced smile as a guest walked past without looking at her. She had no idea that 30 feet above her, in the shadows of the mezzanine, the man who called her his wife had just set into motion something that would burn her family's entire world to the ground within 72 hours. She only knew that when the gala ended, she would slip away through the side entrance, as she always did on the nights he was in the city, and disappear into a car with tinted windows that would take her somewhere no one from this ballroom would ever think to look. Somewhere she was not the ugly, obese one. Somewhere she was simply Valerie. His Valerie. And for the first time in 31 years, someone was finally about to make her family pay for every single word. The car dropped Valerie 2 blocks from the private office, exactly the way it always did. No headlights lingered too long. No driver waited to watch which door she walked through. That was the rule Gabriel had built around their marriage from the very beginning. No trail, no witnesses, no mistakes. 2 years of secrecy had taught her how to disappear into a city of 8 million people without anyone noticing she was gone. She still had Chloe's Birkin bag looped over her arm. She hadn't even realized she was still carrying it until she reached the elevator of the nondescript industrial building in the warehouse district, its exterior dark and unremarkable, giving no hint that the top floor belonged to one of the most powerful men in the city. The elevator doors opened directly into Gabriel's private office, and he was already standing there waiting for her, jacket gone, sleeves rolled to his forearms, the tension from the gala still written across his face. "You kept the bag," he said, a small, tired smile tugging at his mouth. Valerie looked down at the designer bag still hanging from her wrist and let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I didn't even notice." She set it down on the glass table like it weighed nothing now, like it wasn't the same object her sister had thrown at her an hour earlier without a second glance. "I think I just went numb by the end of the night." Gabriel crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms before she could say anything else. She let herself sink into him, the tightness in her shoulders finally loosening for the first time all evening. This was the only place in her entire life where she didn't have to hold herself together. With Gabriel, she could simply exist. "I saw everything," he murmured into her hair. "The coats, the bags, what Chloe said about your wardrobe." Valerie pulled back slightly, surprised. "You were there?" "I'm always there when your family hosts something this big," he said, his voice low and controlled, though she could hear the anger simmering underneath it. "I don't sit through those events for the champagne, Valerie. I sit through them to watch how they treat you when they think no one important is paying attention." She didn't know what to say to that. In 2 years of marriage, she still hadn't fully adjusted to the idea that someone watched over her like this, quietly, patiently, without ever asking anything in return. Her family had spent 3 decades making her feel like a burden. Gabriel had spent 2 years making her feel like she was the only thing in the world worth protecting. "I have something to show you," he said, stepping back and walking toward his desk. He picked up a thick folder and held it out to her. "Sit down first." Valerie sank into the leather chair across from his desk, a flicker of nervousness rising in her chest. Gabriel rarely used the phrase, "sit down first," unless what came next was going to change something significant. She opened the folder and stared at the documents inside. Deed transfers, architectural blueprints, financial statements with numbers so large she had to read them twice. At the top of the first page, in bold black letters, was a name she recognized instantly. A name her family had been chasing for almost a year. Apex Tower. "This can't be right," she whispered, flipping through page after page. "My family's firm has been trying to lease office space in Apex Tower for months. Julian said it was impossible, that the ownership group wouldn't even respond to their calls." "The ownership group wouldn't respond," Gabriel said calmly, "because as of 6 o'clock this evening, there is no ownership group. There's just me." Valerie looked up at him, stunned. "You bought the entire tower?" "All 60 stories," he confirmed. leaning against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. "It closed quietly. Through 3 shell companies your brother has no way of tracing back to me. Your family has spent months begging to lease 3 floors in a building they didn't know I already owned outright." For a moment, Valerie simply sat there, trying to absorb the scale of what he was telling her. This wasn't a gesture. This wasn't revenge in the small, petty way she sometimes imagined when she lay awake replaying her mother's cruelty. This was something enormous, a foundation being built beneath her, brick by brick, without her family ever noticing the ground shifting under their feet. "Gabriel," she said slowly, "what exactly are you planning to do with it?" He knelt in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his dark eyes steady on hers. "I'm going to give it your name," he said simply. "I want the whole city to know that Valerie Vance owns the building her family has been groveling to get into. I want your mother to walk past it every single day of her life and remember exactly what she called you at every gala she ever dragged you to." Valerie's throat tightened. "And the marriage?" "I want to announce it," Gabriel said. "Tonight, if you'll let me. I'm tired of hiding you like something shameful, Valerie. You are my wife. You should never have had to disappear through a side door to be with me." She wanted to say yes. Every instinct in her told her to let him do it immediately, to let the whole world see what her family had refused to see for 31 years. But another part of her, the careful, methodical part that had survived 3 decades of walking on eggshells, held her back. "Not tonight," she said quietly. "Give me 1 more day." Gabriel's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because Julian is forcing me to sign something tomorrow morning," she said, her voice steadying with a resolve that surprised even her. "Some kind of liability paperwork for the company. He's been strange about it for weeks. If your legal team is already auditing the firm's books, I want to know exactly what he's trying to make me responsible for before you reveal anything. Let me sign it first. Let your lawyers see exactly how deep the fraud goes before the whole city is watching us." Gabriel studied her for a long moment, something like pride flickering behind his eyes. "You're not afraid anymore," he said quietly. "I am," Valerie admitted, "but I'm tired of being afraid quietly. Give me 1 more day, Gabriel, then let the whole city burn it down with us." Morning light spilled through the tall windows of Whitmore Logistics, but the air inside the glass-walled boardroom felt colder than any of the outside air conditioning could explain. Valerie sat at the far end of the long conference table, a stack of documents pushed toward her by her brother Julian, who hadn't even bothered to sit down. He stood over her instead, arms crossed, his tie loosened like he'd already spent the whole morning arguing with someone on the phone. "Sign at the bottom of every page," Julian said, tapping a manicured finger against the paper. "There's a sticky note where you need your signature. Don't read the whole thing, it'll take forever, and frankly, you wouldn't understand half of it anyway." Valerie glanced down at the first page. The language was dense, full of financial terms she recognized just enough to feel a chill crawl up her spine. Liability assumption, indemnification, personal guarantee. She had spent enough years quietly observing her family's business dealings, even while being excluded from them, to know these were not routine forms. "What exactly am I signing, Julian?" Her brother let out an impatient sigh, the same sigh he'd been giving her since they were children, as if her simply asking a question was an inconvenience to his day. "It's restructuring paperwork. The firm took on some debt during the expansion last year, and legal wants a family member listed as a secondary guarantor. It's a formality." "A formality," Valerie repeated flatly. "Yes." Julian's jaw tightened. "Look, Mom and I have too much riding on the Apex Tower lease right now to deal with lawyers dragging their feet over paperwork. You don't have a job, you don't have investments, you don't have anything to lose if it comes down to it. You're useless anyway, so at least be useful for this." The words landed exactly where Julian intended them to. A year ago, maybe even a few months ago, they would have crushed her into silence. But sitting there now, with the memory of Gabriel's hands steady around hers the night before, something in Valerie had shifted. She didn't feel the familiar urge to shrink. She felt something colder, quieter, clarity. She picked up the pen. "Where do I sign?" she asked. Julian blinked, clearly surprised by how easily she'd given in. He flipped through the pages, pointing to sticky note after sticky note, watching her hand move across each signature line with something between relief and mild suspicion. He hadn't expected her to comply so quickly. He also hadn't expected to notice, buried somewhere beneath his impatience, that his sister's hand wasn't shaking the way it usually did in these rooms. "There," he said when she'd signed the final page. "That wasn't so hard." "No," Valerie said quietly, sliding the papers back across the table. "It wasn't." What Julian didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every page she just signed was a document Gabriel's legal team had already obtained copies of 2 days earlier, pulled quietly through a contact inside the city's corporate filings office. His auditors had spent the last 48 hours tracing the exact debts Julian was now trying to attach to her name, following a trail of falsified invoices, inflated shipping contracts, and money moved through accounts that didn't officially exist. Valerie signing this paperwork wasn't a trap closing around her. It was the final piece confirming exactly how deep her family's fraud went, voluntarily provided in her own handwriting, time-stamped and witnessed by her own brother. She had walked into the boardroom that morning already knowing what these documents would reveal. Gabriel had told her the night before, gently, that if she went through with signing them, she would be handing his lawyers the last piece of evidence they needed to move against the company entirely. She had chosen to do it anyway, not because she wanted to hurt her family, though some small, long-buried part of her did, but because she was finally tired of being the only one in that family who followed the rules while everyone else broke them and blamed her for the consequences. Julian gathered the signed papers and walked out of the boardroom without another word, already dialing someone on his phone, likely bragging to their mother about how easily he'd secured Valerie's signature. He didn't look back to see his sister still sitting at the long table, staring at the glass walls of the office she had worked in, without pay, without title, without recognition, for the past 6 years. Valerie stood slowly and walked to the small office she'd been given at the far end of the floor, barely larger than a supply closet, tucked away from the executive suites where her mother and siblings worked. It wasn't much. A desk, a chair, a few framed photos she'd never bothered to hang because no one ever visited to see them anyway. She began packing her things into a single canvas bag, a spare cardigan, an old notebook full of logistics routes she'd memorized over the years just to feel useful, a small potted plant that had somehow survived years of being ignored, much like she had. She didn't cry. She thought she might, standing there in the quiet office for what she knew would be the last time, but instead she felt strangely light, like she was setting down a weight she'd been carrying. She walked past the reception desk, past the framed magazine covers of her mother smiling at charity events, past the glass door with the Whitmore Logistics logo etched into it, and out into the morning sunlight of the financial district without a single person stopping her to ask where she was going. Outside, she pulled out her phone and typed a short message, her thumb hovering over the send button for only a second before she pressed it. "The trap is set. I signed everything. Whatever your lawyers need to move, they have it now." 3 dots appeared almost instantly, Gabriel typing back within seconds, as if he'd been waiting by his phone all morning. "Good girl. Come home. Tomorrow night, the whole city finds out who you really are." Valerie slipped her phone back into a bag and walked toward the waiting car at the curb, not once looking back at the building where she'd spent 31 years trying to earn love that was never coming. For the first time in her life, she wasn't walking away in shame. She was walking towards something entirely her own. The Skyview rooftop lounge sat perched 40 stories above the harbor, its glass walls offering an unobstructed view of the city skyline glittering across the water. Beatrice had chosen it specifically for tonight's dinner, a celebration, she'd told the small group of investors joining them, for a business opportunity that was, in her words, finally coming together after months of persistence. She sat at the head of the table in a champagne-colored dress, a glass of wine in hand, watching Julian charm the two investors seated across from them with talk of expansion plans and projected quarterly growth. Chloe sat beside her mother, scrolling through her phone, occasionally looking up to laugh at whatever joke Julian had just made. "To new beginnings," Beatrice said, raising her glass, "and to finally securing office space in Apex Tower. It's taken longer than it should have, but everything worthwhile does." Glasses clinked around the table. Nobody noticed the slight pause in the conversation as one of the investors glanced toward the window, his expression shifting from polite attention to something closer to confusion. "Is that supposed to happen?" he asked, nodding toward the harbor. Beatrice turned, following his gaze, and felt the champagne glass slip slightly in her fingers. Across the bay, the Apex Tower, all 60 stories of glass and steel that had dominated the skyline for a decade, had gone completely dark. Every light in every window, every exterior floodlight that normally lit the building like a beacon at night, had switched off at once. For a moment, it looked like the tower had simply vanished from the skyline, swallowed by the night sky. "Power outage, maybe," Julian said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Probably a grid issue on that side of the harbor." Then the panels began to light up. Not the old static floodlights the tower had used for years, but something new. Thousands of LED glass panels installed across the entire face of the building, each one flickering to life in perfect sequence, building a wave of white light that climbed from the base of the tower to its peak. The restaurant fell into a hush, other diners rising from their seats, drinks abandoned, phones lifted to capture the spectacle unfolding across the water. Beatrice stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, her wineglass forgotten on the table. The light stopped moving. And then, letter by letter, bold and glowing against the black glass, 6 words began to form across the entire face of the building, each character taller than a city bus, visible from every corner of the harbor, from every rooftop bar and passing boat and news helicopter that would inevitably be scrambled within minutes. Valerie Vance, sole owner and queen of the Vance estate. For a long moment, nobody at the table spoke. The two investors exchanged a bewildered glance. Chloe's phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the table, forgotten. Julian's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. "That's a mistake," Beatrice finally said, though her voice wavered on every word. "That has to be some kind of technical error, or a prank. A rival firm, maybe, trying to embarrass us in front of our investors." But even as she said it, she couldn't stop staring at the name glowing across the skyline. Not just any name. Her daughter's name. The daughter who had spent the last 6 years fetching coffee and carrying coats, who had never once, in 31 years, shown a single sign of ambition or independence that Beatrice had noticed, because Beatrice had never once looked closely enough to see it. Around them, the entire restaurant had turned into chaos. Diners at nearby tables were standing, filming the tower with their phones raised high, whispering to each other, some already searching the name online. A waiter near the window murmured to a colleague, loud enough for Beatrice to catch fragments. "Vance, isn't that the crime family? The shipping magnate?" "Julian," Beatrice snapped, her composure cracking for the first time in front of the investors. "Call the building management. Call the news stations. Someone needs to take this down immediately." But it was already too late. Across the room, a television mounted above the bar, usually playing quiet sports highlights for patrons, had switched to a breaking news broadcast. A local news anchor sat behind her desk, visibly startled, narrating live footage of the illuminated tower as it filled the entire screen behind her. "We're getting reports flooding in right now about this stunning display over the harbor, where the newly renamed Apex Tower has revealed the name Valerie Vance in massive illuminated letters." Sources close to City Hall confirm the tower's ownership transferred quietly just yesterday evening, though details remain unclear. "We're working to learn more about who Valerie Vance is and what her connection to the tower might be." Beatrice sat back down heavily in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone, dialing Valerie's number with shaking fingers. The call rang twice before going straight to voicemail. She dialed again. Voicemail. "She's not answering," Beatrice said, more to herself than to anyone else at the table. Chloe, still staring at the glowing letters across the bay, finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain in a way none of them had ever heard from her before. "Mom, why would anyone put Valerie's name on a building like that?" Nobody at the table had an answer. The two investors, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, exchanged quiet, uncomfortable glances before quietly excusing themselves from the table, muttering something about needing to make a phone call, though everyone present understood exactly what that meant. They were leaving, and they weren't coming back. Beatrice remained frozen in her seat, staring across the water at the impossible letters glowing against the night sky, her mind racing through every memory of her youngest daughter. The quiet one, the invisible one, the one she had spent 3 decades reminding of exactly how little she was worth. "Sole owner," the letters read. Somewhere in the pit of her stomach, beneath the confusion and the disbelief, a cold, creeping fear began to settle in. Because whatever this was, whoever had done this, one thing had already become impossible to deny. Her daughter was no longer invisible. And Beatrice had absolutely no idea what that meant for what was coming next. Nobody at the Whitmore mansion slept that night. Beatrice sat in the study long after they'd returned from the harbor, still in her champagne-colored dress, her phone glued to her ear as she dialed Valerie's number for what felt like the 50th time. Voicemail. Every single time. Voicemail. Followed by that same maddeningly calm recorded voice. "You've reached Valerie. Please leave a message." "She's blocked me," Beatrice muttered, tossing the phone onto the desk. "Or lost the phone, or—" She stopped, unable to land on an explanation that made any sense at all. Julian paced the length of the study, his tie long gone, his shirt collar unbuttoned, a laptop open on the desk displaying local news coverage that had only grown since the night before. What had started as a single confused broadcast had multiplied into dozens of segments, blog posts, and social media threads, all circling the same unanswerable question. Who is Valerie Vance? And why does she own Apex Tower? "It has to be a hoax," Julian said, though he'd said the same thing at least 10 times since midnight, each repetition sounding less convincing than the last. "Someone hacked the building's lighting system, a rival firm trying to embarrass us before the Apex lease negotiations. It has nothing to do with our Valerie." "Then why," Beatrice said slowly, "hasn't anyone been able to reach her since last night?" Nobody had an answer for that either. By morning, the confusion had curdled into something far more urgent. Julian's phone rang just after 8, and he answered it, expecting another reporter fishing for a comment. Instead, it was the company's finance director, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Julian, I need you to come into the office right now. Every corporate credit line is frozen, all 3 of them. The bank says there's a legal hold on the accounts, effective as of yesterday evening." Julian nearly dropped the phone. "Frozen? By who?" "They won't say. Something about a court order tied to an active fraud investigation. Julian, we can't process payroll. We can't clear outgoing invoices. The whole operation is locked." The call ended, and Julian stood frozen in the middle of the study, the laptop screen still glowing behind him with headlines about the illuminated tower. Beatrice watched her son's face drain of color and felt her own stomach twist into a knot she couldn't untangle. "What is it?" she said. Not a question, a demand. "The accounts," Julian said quietly. "All of them. Frozen. Payroll, operating capital, everything. Someone filed a fraud claim against the company." Beatrice's mind raced backward, sifting through months of decisions, contracts, invoices she'd signed without reading too closely because Julian assured her the numbers worked out fine. She thought of the falsified shipping manifests from the spring, the inflated client contracts Julian had used to secure last year's expansion loan, the money quietly shuffled between accounts to make the firm's books look healthier than they actually were. None of it had ever been meant for outside eyes. None of it should have been traceable back to them. Not without someone deliberately digging, with resources and legal power far beyond what any ordinary competitor could access. "Someone did this on purpose," Beatrice said slowly, the pieces beginning, horribly, to align in her mind. "The tower, the name, the accounts. This isn't a coincidence, Julian. Someone is dismantling us." "But who," Julian said, his voice cracking slightly, "would have the power to freeze corporate accounts overnight? That's not something a rival firm can do. That takes real legal authority, real money." He stopped mid-sentence, both of them arriving at the same unbearable thought at once, though neither wanted to say it out loud first. Chloe walked into the study at that moment, still in yesterday's dress, mascara smudged beneath her eyes from a night spent scrolling through endless news coverage on her phone. "I found something," she said quietly, holding her phone out toward her mother. "A financial blog posted this an hour ago." Beatrice took the phone with shaking hands and read the headline aloud, her voice growing fainter with every word. "Mystery buyer behind Apex Tower purchase linked to Vance shipping conglomerate. Sources suggest ties to underworld financier Gabriel Vance." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Everyone in the city's business circles knew the name Gabriel Vance, even if very few people had ever actually seen his face. He was spoken about in hushed tones at industry events, a man who owned half the shipping ports on the eastern seaboard, whose companies moved goods no customs agent ever dared inspect too closely, whose name alone was enough to make hardened businessmen suddenly remember prior engagements. Nobody crossed Gabriel Vance. Nobody even claimed to fully know him. "That's impossible," Julian said, though his voice had lost all its earlier bravado. "Why would someone like that have anything to do with Valerie?" Beatrice said nothing, staring down at the blurry photo attached to the article. Gabriel Vance's face, partially obscured by sunglasses and a raised collar, taken years earlier at some industry gala nobody could quite recall. She thought of every time Valerie had disappeared quietly at night, every excuse her daughter had given for slipping away unnoticed, every time Beatrice had simply assumed her invisible daughter had nowhere better to be. "She's stealing from us," Beatrice said suddenly, her fear curdling into something sharper, more familiar. Anger was easier to hold than confusion. "That's what this is. She's found some criminal to help her steal the company out from under us, to punish us for whatever imagined grievances she's been nursing all these years." "We need to call the police," Julian said, seizing on the idea like a lifeline. "File a report, say she embezzled funds, that she's colluding with a known criminal organization against the family business. Get ahead of this before the press digs any deeper." Beatrice nodded slowly, already reaching for the phone, her hands steadier now that she had a plan, however desperate. She dialed the local precinct, her voice shifting instantly into the polished, wounded tone she used for every crisis, real or manufactured. "Yes, hello. I need to report a case of corporate theft and possible embezzlement," she said. "My daughter, Valerie Whitmore. I believe she's been stealing from our family business." None of them noticed the black SUV that had already pulled quietly into the long driveway outside, its tinted windows reflecting the gray morning light, waiting. Beatrice was still on the phone with the police dispatcher, mid-sentence, when Julian's head snapped toward the window. "There's a car outside," he said. "Several cars." Beatrice lowered the phone slowly, the dispatcher's voice still crackling faintly on the other end, asking her to confirm the address. She walked to the study window and pulled back the heavy curtain, and what she saw stole the breath straight out of her lungs. A convoy of black SUVs, 5 of them, each with tinted windows and no visible plates, had pulled into the long circular driveway of the Whitmore estate, arranged in a formation that looked less like a visit and more like an operation. Doors opened in perfect, practiced unison. Men in dark suits stepped out, moving with the calm, unhurried precision of people who had done this exact thing many times before, taking positions around the perimeter of the house without a single wasted movement. "Julian," Beatrice whispered, the phone slipping from her hand and clattering onto the desk, the dispatcher's voice still faintly asking if she was still there. "Julian, who are these people?" Julian didn't answer. He was already backing away from the window, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by something closer to primal fear. Chloe appeared in the doorway of the study, her face white, clutching her phone to her chest like it might shield her from whatever was happening outside. The front door of the mansion didn't knock. It simply opened, the heavy oak swinging inward on its hinges as if the house itself had decided to surrender, and footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, unhurried, deliberate, the sound of someone who had never once in his life needed to rush toward anything. Gabriel Vance walked into the Whitmore family's living room like he already owned it, because in every way that mattered, he did. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the room in a way that made the expensive furniture and the towering bookshelves suddenly feel small and insignificant. 2 of his men flanked the doorway behind him, silent, watchful, and beside him, walking with a composure Beatrice had never once seen from her youngest daughter, was Valerie. She wasn't dressed like the girl who had carried coats and handbags 2 nights earlier. She wore a sharp, tailored coat, her hair pulled back, her chin lifted in a way that made the room's 3 stunned occupants suddenly aware of exactly how much they had underestimated her for 31 years. "Valerie," Beatrice breathed, taking a stumbling step forward. Who is this man? What have you done?" Gabriel answered before Valerie could, his voice low, calm, and utterly without mercy. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't believe we've properly met." "Get out of my house," Beatrice said, though the command carried none of its usual authority, wavering under the weight of the men positioned throughout her foyer. "This isn't your house anymore," Gabriel said simply. "Not for much longer, anyway." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thin leather folder, walking to the center of the room and setting it down on the glass coffee table with a soft, deliberate click. He opened it and spread 2 documents across the surface, angling them so the entire family could see clearly. The first was a marriage certificate, its gold seal catching the morning light. 2 names, side by side. Gabriel Alexander Vance, Valerie Elizabeth Whitmore. A date from 2 years earlier. The second was a property deed, the words Apex Tower printed across the top in bold official lettering, and beneath it, listed as sole owner, the same name that had glowed across the entire city skyline the night before. Julian stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic if you looked long enough. Chloe had gone completely silent, her earlier bravado from the gala nowhere to be found. Beatrice simply stood frozen, staring between the documents and her daughter's face, searching for some sign that this was a trick, a manipulation, anything other than the truth sitting plainly in front of her. 2 years ago, Gabriel said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room, I married your daughter, the woman you have spent 31 years calling the ugly obese one, the woman you made stand by service exits carrying coats while you paraded her siblings in front of your wealthy friends. That woman is my wife. This is insane, Beatrice managed, though her voice had lost all its earlier fire. Valerie, tell him this is a mistake. Tell him. It's not a mistake, Mother, Valerie said quietly, and something about the calm steadiness of her voice silenced the room more completely than anything Gabriel had said. I've been his wife for 2 years. I've watched you humiliate me at every single event you dragged me to, and I never said a word, because I believed, somewhere deep down, that if I just endured it long enough, you'd eventually see me. You never did, so I stopped waiting for you to. Gabriel stepped closer to Beatrice, his presence somehow making the woman who had spent 31 years dominating every room she entered visibly shrink. "I also own 100% of your company's outstanding debt," he said. "Every fraudulent invoice, every falsified contract, every dollar your son quietly funneled through accounts that shouldn't exist, all of it belongs to me now. As of yesterday evening, Whitmore Logistics does not have a single line of credit that isn't, in some way, mine to control." Julian's legs seemed to give out slightly, and he sank into the nearest armchair, his face buried in his hands. Chloe had begun to cry silently by the doorway, though whether from fear or humiliation, it was impossible to tell. Beatrice looked at her daughter one final time, searching for some trace of the quiet, apologetic girl who had spent 31 years absorbing every cruel word without complaint. She didn't find her. In her place stood a woman Beatrice didn't recognize at all, steady, composed, and utterly unmoved by her mother's fear for the first time in her entire life. "You called me useless," Valerie said softly, echoing Julian's words from the boardroom 2 days earlier. "I signed everything you put in front of me, Mother. Every single page. I want you to remember that the next time you tell yourself I never did anything for this family." Gabriel closed the leather folder with a quiet, final snap, the sound somehow louder than anything that had been said in the room so far. "We'll be in touch," he said, "through our lawyers." He offered Valerie his arm, and together they walked out of the mansion, past the stunned, silent men in dark suits, leaving the Whitmore family standing frozen in the wreckage of everything they had spent 31 years believing about the daughter they had never once bothered to truly see. News of the illuminated tower and the very public humiliation of the Whitmore family spread through the city's underworld even faster than it had spread through the press. By the time Gabriel and Valerie's motorcade left the mansion, phones were already ringing in penthouses and back rooms across the city, carrying the same piece of gossip dressed up in different words. Gabriel Vance has a wife, a civilian, and he just declared it to the entire world. Dominic Moretti heard the news over breakfast, scrolling through a grainy video of the glowing tower on his phone while his coffee went cold in front of him. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with cold eyes and a reputation for smiling right before he made someone disappear. For years, he had run the Western Docks in an uneasy, silent truce with Gabriel Vance, 2 syndicates carved into separate territories, neither one foolish enough to test the other's strength directly. But a wife changed things. A wife was a weakness. A wife was leverage. "He's gone soft," Moretti said to the men gathered around his kitchen table, tossing his phone onto the counter with a satisfied smirk. "Parading some civilian around like a trophy, marrying into a bankrupt logistics family, for what, sentiment? Vance built his empire on being untouchable, and now he's handed us the one thing that was never supposed to exist, something he actually cares about losing." His lieutenant, a wiry man named Reyes, no relation to Gabriel's Marco, leaned forward. "You want to move on her?" "I want to send a message," Moretti said. "Vance thinks announcing a marriage makes him stronger. I'm going to show this city exactly how much weaker it makes him." The motorcade left the Whitmore estate just after 2 in the afternoon, but by the time evening fell, Gabriel had rerouted their return to the penthouse through the outer city limits, a longer, quieter path through the industrial districts that his security team preferred whenever tensions in the city ran high. Valerie sat beside him in the back of the lead SUV, still processing the weight of everything that had happened that morning, watching the warehouses and rail yards blur past the tinted windows in the fading light. "You're quiet," Gabriel said, studying her profile. "I keep waiting to feel guilty," Valerie admitted. And I don't. I thought I would. You don't owe them guilt, Gabriel said simply. Not after 31 years. The convoy slowed as it approached the old rail yard on the outer edge of the industrial district, a stretch of rusted freight cars and cracked pavement that had been abandoned for over a decade, still used occasionally as a shortcut between the harbor roads and the downtown corridor. It was the kind of place where streetlights had long since stopped working, and cell service flickered in and out between towering stacks of shipping containers. It was also, Valerie would later realize, the perfect place for an ambush. The first vehicle in Moretti's blockade appeared without warning, sliding sideways across the narrow access road just ahead of the motorcade, forcing Gabriel's lead driver to slam the brakes hard enough to throw Valerie against her seatbelt. Gunfire erupted almost immediately, sharp, controlled bursts aimed at the tires of the trailing vehicles, followed by the deafening crack of rounds striking the reinforced armor of Gabriel's SUV. "Down," Gabriel said, pulling Valerie low against the seat, his body shielding hers instinctively as the driver swerved hard, trying to find an opening between the rail cars.
"They're boxing us in," the driver called back, his voice tight. "No clean path forward, they've got the main road blocked." For a moment, panic threatened to overtake her. The sound of gunfire, the sharp jolt of the vehicle swerving, the memory of every quiet warning Gabriel had ever given her about the dangers that came with his world. But as Valerie pressed her hand against the window, staring out at the maze of rusted rail cars and shipping containers illuminated by the SUV's headlights, something unexpected surfaced through the fear. She recognized this place.
"Gabriel," she said suddenly, sitting up despite his hand trying to keep her low. "I know this rail yard. My family's logistics firm used to route overflow shipments through here years ago, before the city condemned it. There's a service road behind the third row of containers. It connects to an old loading dock that comes out near the harbor bypass. It's not on any current map because the city stopped maintaining it, but it's still there." The driver glanced back at her through the rearview mirror, uncertain. "You're sure?" "I used to memorize these routes just to feel useful," Valerie said, an edge of dark irony creeping into her voice. "Turn left after the fourth container stack, not the third. The third one dead ends into a collapsed loading bay. The gap you want is narrow, but it's wide enough for this vehicle if you take it slow." Gabriel looked at her for half a second, something sharp and proud flickering behind the urgency in his eyes, before he turned to the driver. "Do exactly what she says." The SUV cut hard through the gap between the fourth stack of shipping containers, metal screeching faintly against the vehicle's side mirror as it squeezed through the narrow passage Valerie had described. Gunfire continued behind them, muffled now by the maze of rail cars, Moretti's men scrambling to adjust their positions as the motorcade vanished from their sightlines entirely. Within minutes, the SUV emerged onto the quiet stretch of the old harbor bypass road, clear and empty, the sounds of the ambush fading into the distance behind them. The rest of Gabriel's convoy, guided by the same directions relayed urgently over radio, followed the same escape route moments later, every vehicle emerging intact. Gabriel exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as the SUV picked up speed toward the safety of downtown. He looked over at Valerie, who sat with her hands still trembling slightly in her lap, adrenaline finally catching up to her now that the immediate danger had passed. "You just saved this entire motorcade," he said quietly. Valerie let out a shaky breath, staring down at her hands. "My family spent 31 years telling me I was useless," she said. "Turns out all that time I spent trying to be useful to them was about to save both our lives instead." Gabriel reached over and took her trembling hands in his, steadying them. "Moretti just made a mistake he doesn't understand yet," he said, his voice hardening with quiet resolve. "He thought he was exploiting a weakness. He just handed me a reason to end him." Gabriel's war room occupied the entire top floor of the Vance Syndicate headquarters, a converted penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor where, just 2 nights earlier, Valerie's name had blazed across the tower for the whole city to see. Now, at 7 in the morning, the same windows framed a gray, overcast sky, the glass tower across the water still glowing faintly with her name, a permanent fixture against the skyline. Marco stood at the head of a long steel table covered in maps, shipping manifests, and surveillance photographs, briefing a room of a dozen of Gabriel's most trusted men on the failed ambush from the night before. Valerie sat near the end of the table, still in yesterday's clothes, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in front of her. She had refused Gabriel's suggestion that she go rest in the penthouse upstairs. "I'm not hiding," she'd told him firmly. "Not after last night." Gabriel hadn't argued.
Moretti's men retreated the moment they lost visual on the convoy, Marco was saying, pointing to a marked section of the rail yard on the map.
"No injuries on our side, but he's made his intentions clear. This wasn't a warning shot. He was trying to eliminate the entire motorcade, which means eliminating both of you." "Where's Moretti operating out of these days?" Gabriel asked, his voice flat, controlled, the fury from the night before compressed into something colder and far more dangerous. "Officially, the Western Docks," Marco said. "But we've never confirmed where he's actually storing product. He's been careful about that for years. Every warehouse we've raided over the last decade has come up empty. Decoys, most of them." Valerie had been quiet through most of the briefing, staring down at the shipping manifests scattered across the table, something familiar nagging at the edge of her memory.
She reached forward and pulled one of the documents closer, scanning the columns of numbers and routing codes with the same practiced eyes she'd developed over 6 years of being handed her family's overflow paperwork nobody else wanted to deal with.
"These shipping codes," she said slowly, cutting through the conversation.
Every head in the room turned toward her.
"I recognize this formatting. It's not standard freight documentation. It's the same coding system my family's logistics firm used for their off-book shipments." Gabriel straightened. "Your family worked with Moretti?" "Not directly, not that I ever knew," Valerie said, still studying the manifest. "But Julian handled a lot of our overflow contracts personally, and he was always secretive about a specific set of clients he never let anyone else touch. I used to file the paperwork for those shipments because nobody else wanted the tedious work. I never asked questions. I was just grateful to have something to do." Her mouth tightened. "Looking at this now, the routing codes match exactly. Same numbering pattern, same coded destination markers. I'd bet everything I have that Julian was quietly moving Moretti's contraband through our family's legitimate shipping routes for years,
hiding it inside normal freight manifests." Marco leaned over the table, studying the documents with new interest.
"That would explain how Moretti's product has stayed untraceable for so long. Nobody investigates a logistics firm that's been operating cleanly on paper for decades." "Can you identify which routes were being used?" Gabriel asked, watching Valerie with an intensity that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with quiet, growing admiration. Valerie pulled the notebook out of her bag, the same one she'd taken from her office 2 days earlier, filled with years of memorized routes and shipping patterns she'd copied down out of habit, never imagining they would ever matter to anyone. She flipped through pages of her own handwriting, cross-referencing them against the coded manifests on the table.
"There," she said, tapping a specific entry. "This route runs through a warehouse complex near the old fishing pier, registered under a shell company called Red Line Freight Solutions. Julian always handled that account personally, and he never let the shipping department touch the paperwork. I always assumed it was just a difficult client. It's not on any of Moretti's known properties because it's not registered to him at all. It's registered to my family's company." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of what she'd just uncovered settling over everyone present. Gabriel walked around the table and stood beside her chair, looking down at the notebook full of her handwriting, years of careful, invisible diligence that her family had never once acknowledged, now unraveling one of the city's most elusive criminal operations in a matter of minutes. "You just found what my intelligence division has been searching for over a decade," Gabriel said quietly. "I told you," Valerie said, a faint, dry smile finally breaking through the exhaustion on her face.
31 years of being useful to people who never noticed. Turns out, I noticed everything."
Gabriel turned to Marco, his expression hardening into the same cold resolve Valerie had seen the night of the ambush. "Get a strike team assembled. I want eyes on that warehouse within the hour. Full surveillance before we move. If Valerie's information is accurate, that's where Moretti's been storing product for years." "And if it's a trap?" Marco asked. "Then we'll know within the first 10 minutes, Gabriel said. "But I don't think it is. Moretti doesn't know she saw those manifests. He has no idea what she just handed us." By early afternoon, Gabriel's men had confirmed everything. Cargo trucks moving in and out of the warehouse at odd hours, security patterns that matched Moretti's known operational habits, and enough visual confirmation of unmarked crates to justify moving immediately. The raid that followed happened with the same brutal efficiency Gabriel's organization was known for throughout the city's underworld: swift, decisive, and utterly without mercy for a rival who had made the mistake of assuming Gabriel's civilian wife would be his weakness. By nightfall, Moretti's entire smuggling operation had been dismantled in a single coordinated strike, his warehouses seized, his men scattered or captured, his territory absorbed quietly into the Vance Syndicate's growing empire. Moretti himself vanished from the city entirely within 24 hours, understanding, far too late, exactly what kind of mistake he'd made, underestimating the woman he'd assumed was nothing more than a soft, sentimental liability. Back in the war room that evening, Gabriel poured 2 glasses of scotch and handed one to Valerie, who sat exhausted, but unmistakably lighter than she had been in years. "To 31 years of being underestimated," he said, raising his glass. Valerie clinked her glass against his, a small, tired smile finally reaching her eyes. "And the last day anyone ever will." The letter arrived at Whitmore Logistics on a Thursday morning, delivered not by mail, but by hand, carried into the lobby by a courier in a plain gray suit who asked for Julian Whitmore by name and refused to leave until someone signed for it. Julian tore it open at his desk, expecting another round of vague legal threats his own attorneys had been fielding for days. Instead, he found something far more final. Notice of debt enforcement and asset seizure. The letter was 3 pages long, dense with legal language, but the meaning underneath it was brutally simple. Every outstanding debt Whitmore Logistics had accumulated over the past 3 years, the falsified contracts, the inflated loans, the fraudulent invoices Julian had used to keep the company's books looking healthier than they actually were, had been consolidated and purchased in full by a holding company controlled entirely by Gabriel Vance. The debt was no longer owed to a handful of banks and investors who might have been persuaded to negotiate, restructure, or wait. It was owed, in its entirety, to a man who had no interest in negotiation of any kind. And Gabriel Vance was calling it due. Immediately. "This can't be enforceable," Julian said, his voice cracking as he read the letter a 3rd time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. "There has to be a grace period, some kind of appeals process." "There isn't," said the company's attorney, standing stiffly in the doorway of Julian's office, a folder of his own tucked under his arm. "I've reviewed the original loan agreements you signed last year, Julian. The default and acceleration clauses are airtight. The moment your company missed a single payment cycle, which it has because every account is frozen, the entire debt becomes due in full, with the creditor having full legal right to seize company assets to satisfy it." "Then we'll fight it," Julian said, standing so abruptly his chair rolled backward and struck the wall behind him. "We'll get an injunction. We'll—" "Julian." The attorney's voice was quiet, almost pitying. "The paperwork authorizing this entire consolidation was signed voluntarily by a company officer 3 days ago. Your sister's signature is on every page." Julian went very still. By 10 that morning, marshals arrived at the Whitmore Logistics building, not with the courtesy of advance notice, but with the same quiet, procedural efficiency with which everything else had unfolded over the past week.
They moved through the offices with clipboards and evidence tags, cataloguing furniture, computers, filing cabinets, the framed magazine covers of Beatrice smiling at charity galas that had lined the reception hallway for years. Employees stood in stunned clusters near the elevators, watching decades of family business dismantled in the span of a single morning. Whispered questions passing between them that nobody had answers to. Julian was given exactly 2 hours to remove personal items from his office.
He stood in the doorway, watching a marshal place a red seizure notice across the glass, the same door he had walked through every morning for the past 8 years, believing it would eventually bear his name at the top instead of his mother's. At the estate, the scene unfolded with a different kind of cruelty entirely. Beatrice was in the middle of a call with the divorce attorney she'd never actually needed until Julian's ex-wife had begun quietly distancing herself from the family scandal when the doorbell rang. 3 sharp, official knocks that carried none of the polite hesitation of a normal visitor. She opened the door to find 2 marshals standing on her porch, along with a woman holding a clipboard who introduced herself with the flat, practiced tone of someone who delivered devastating news for a living. Mrs. Whitmore, we're here to execute a court-ordered asset seizure on this property. You have 2 hours to gather essential personal belongings. Everything else on the premises is subject to immediate seizure to satisfy an outstanding debt judgment. Beatrice stared at the woman, uncomprehending for a long moment before the words finally landed with their full, crushing weight. "This is my home," she said, her voice rising. "I have lived in this house for 26 years. You cannot simply—"
"I understand this is distressing, ma'am," the woman said, her tone unchanged. "But the court order is not negotiable. I'd recommend you begin gathering your belongings now." Chloe emerged from upstairs at the sound of raised voices, still in pajamas despite the late morning hour, and froze at the top of the staircase as she took in the scene below. Marshals moving methodically through the foyer, tagging the grand piano her mother had never once let anyone touch. The antique furniture Beatrice had spent decades curating for exactly this kind of house, the kind that photographed beautifully in society magazines.
"Mom," Chloe said weakly, "what's happening?"
"Pack a bag," Beatrice said, her voice hollow now, all the fight drained out of it. "Pack whatever you can carry. We have 2 hours." They moved through the house in a daze, grabbing clothes, jewelry, whatever fit into the suitcases they could find, marshals trailing behind them at a respectful distance, tagging furniture and artwork as they passed. Beatrice paused in the hallway outside her bedroom, staring at a framed family photo from years ago. Julian and Chloe smiling at the camera, and behind them, half cut off at the edge of the frame, a much younger Valerie standing slightly apart from the rest, the way she always had in every photograph Beatrice had ever taken of their family. Beatrice reached out and took the photo down, tucking it into her bag without fully understanding why. Some small, buried part of her recognizing, far too late, exactly what that half-cropped image had always represented. By the time the 2 hours had passed, the Whitmore family stood outside their own gates with whatever they could carry, watching marshals seal the mansion's front doors, the house that had defined their entire social identity, now reduced to an asset line item in a legal filing. Their cars had been seized, along with everything else. The same luxury sedans Beatrice had once used to drive past Valerie standing at bus stops without offering her a ride. A single car waited at the curb to take them to a hotel none of them could truly afford anymore, their credit cards frozen alongside everything else, their accounts drained to satisfy debts none of them had ever fully understood the depth of until it was far too late to undo. Chloe sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the mansion shrinking behind them, tears streaking silently down her face. Julian stared straight ahead, saying nothing, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Beatrice sat between them, clutching the single-framed photograph she'd managed to save, staring down at the small, half-visible figure of her youngest daughter standing at the edge of the frame. For the first time in 31 years, Beatrice finally understood exactly how completely she had failed to see the person standing right in front of her. The lobby of Vance Tower had been transformed overnight. What had once been a sleek, impersonal atrium of marble and steel now held a raised platform framed by a wall of national and local news cameras. Dozens of reporters packed shoulder to shoulder behind a velvet rope, their microphones bristling toward the podium like a forest of dark branches. Outside, a crowd had gathered along the street, drawn by 2 days of relentless headlines that had turned Valerie Vance into the most talked-about name in the city. The fall of Whitmore Logistics, the secret wife of Gabriel Vance, from family outcast to empire owner. Every outlet had its own version of the story, but none of them had managed to secure an actual interview. Until today. Valerie stood backstage in a tailored charcoal suit, her hair swept back, watching through a gap in the curtain as the lobby filled past capacity. 2 years ago, she wouldn't have recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror an hour earlier. Steady-eyed, composed, dressed not to disappear into a crowd, but to command one. She smoothed the front of her jacket, feeling the familiar flicker of nerves, though it was quieter now than it used to be, more manageable.
"You don't have to do this," Gabriel said quietly, appearing beside her, adjusting his own jacket cuff with practiced ease. "I can handle the press alone. You've already been through enough this week." "I know I don't have to," Valerie said, turning to face him. "I want to." Something in his expression softened, the same look he'd given her in the war room days earlier, watching her decode Moretti's shipping manifests with a quiet brilliance her family had spent 31 years failing to notice. "Then let's go remind this city exactly who you are." They walked out together, hand in hand, into a wall of camera flashes so bright and constant it felt for a moment like walking into a storm. Gabriel approached the podium first, his presence immediately silencing the restless murmur of the crowd, years of quiet, feared authority settling over the room like a physical weight. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm and measured, carrying easily through the microphones without any need to raise it. "For those who don't already know, my name is Gabriel Vance. 2 years ago, I married the woman standing beside me. Her name is Valerie Vance, and as of this week, she is sole owner of this building and co-director of every enterprise carrying the Vance name." A ripple of murmurs passed through the reporters, pens scratching furiously against notepads, though nobody dared interrupt. "For 31 years, Gabriel continued, his voice hardening slightly, Valerie's own family called her worthless, ugly, a burden to be hidden at the service exits of their own events. They built their business on fraud and cruelty, and when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't because of anything I did to expose them. It surfaced because Valerie chose, after 31 years of silence, to finally stop protecting the people who had never once protected her." He stepped back from the podium, gesturing toward Valerie with quiet, unmistakable pride. Valerie stepped forward, and for a brief moment, standing in front of the wall of cameras and the crowd stretching far beyond the velvet ropes, the old instinct rose in her chest. The urge to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, to make herself smaller so no one would feel threatened by her presence. She let the feeling rise, acknowledged it silently, and then let it pass through her exactly the way she'd trained herself to do for 31 years. Except this time, she wasn't enduring humiliation. She was standing in the light on her own terms. "My family called me the ugly, obese one for as long as I can remember," she began, her voice steady, carrying clearly through the microphones. "They said it at dinner tables, at family gatherings, at every event where they thought it made them look better to have someone to look down on. I spent 31 years believing that if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, made myself useful enough, I would eventually earn the love they always withheld from me." She paused, scanning the sea of cameras, unflinching. "I want to be clear about something," she continued. "This isn't a story about revenge. My husband didn't buy this tower to punish my family, and I'm not standing here today because I wanted to watch them lose everything. I'm standing here because I finally stopped waiting for people who were never going to change to give me permission to exist fully. The moment I stopped shrinking myself for their comfort,
Everything else simply fell into place around that decision. A reporter near the front called out, "Ms. Vance, is it true your family is now facing bankruptcy as a direct result of your marriage becoming public?" "My family's bankruptcy is a direct result of the fraud they committed over several years," Valerie answered evenly, without hesitation. "I didn't create that fraud. I simply stopped protecting it with my silence. There's a difference, and I'd encourage you to remember it when you write your headlines tonight." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd of reporters, several exchanging impressed glances at the composure of a woman none of them had ever heard of a week earlier. From behind the police barricade at the edge of the lobby, kept back along with the general public who had gathered to witness the spectacle, Beatrice stood between Julian and Chloe, watching her daughter command a room full of national media with a steadiness she had never once shown any sign of during 31 years under her mother's roof. Beatrice's hands were clenched at her sides, her face unreadable beneath a thin veil of composure that was rapidly cracking under the weight of everything she was witnessing. Julian stared at the floor, unable to meet his sister's eyes even from this distance. Chloe wiped silently at her face, mascara long since abandoned, watching her sister, the sister she had mocked and dismissed and thrown designer bags at without a second thought, stand in the exact spot Chloe had always assumed would eventually belong to her. Valerie's eyes found her family across the crowded lobby for just a brief moment, separated from her now by rows of reporters, a velvet rope, and an entire life she was finally, permanently leaving behind. She didn't smile at them. She didn't glare. She simply held their gaze for a moment longer than necessary, letting them see exactly what 31 years of underestimating her had cost them, before turning calmly back toward the cameras. "Thank you all for coming," she said, echoing Gabriel's earlier words, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed lobby. "I look forward to showing this city exactly what the Vance name is going to build next." Behind the barricade, completely powerless to do anything but watch, Beatrice finally understood that whatever chance she'd once had to know her daughter had ended the very moment she decided, 31 years earlier, that Valerie wasn't worth the effort of truly seeing. The villa sat on a private stretch of coastline nearly 3 hours outside the city, tucked behind a line of cypress trees that shielded it from the main road, its wide terrace overlooking a bay so still and quiet. It felt like a different world entirely from the harbor where Valerie's name still glowed nightly across the Apex Tower skyline. Gabriel had owned the property for years, though Valerie realized, walking barefoot across the sun-warmed stone for the first time since everything had happened, that this was the first time he had ever brought her here. "You've been saving this place," she said, settling into one of the low wicker chairs facing the water, the sunset beginning to bleed orange and pink across the horizon.
"I wanted somewhere that wasn't connected to any of it," Gabriel said, taking the chair beside her, a slim leather folder resting on his lap. "No syndicate business, no family history, just us." It had been 3 days since the press conference, 3 days since her family's faces had flooded every news outlet in the city, 3 days since Beatrice, Julian, and Chloe had checked into a modest hotel with whatever they could carry, their entire world reduced to a handful of suitcases and a single framed photograph. Valerie hadn't spoken to any of them since the marshals had cleared the mansion. She wasn't sure she ever would again, and for the first time in her life, that thought didn't fill her with guilt. "I keep waiting for it to feel like too much," she admitted, watching the water shift from gold to deep blue as the sun sank lower. "Like I'll wake up tomorrow and realize I destroyed my entire family out of spite." "You didn't destroy anything," Gabriel said. "They destroyed it themselves, years before either of us made a single move. All we did was stop hiding it." Valerie nodded slowly, letting the truth of that settle over her the way the evening breeze settled over the terrace, cool and steady. She thought of the woman she had been a week earlier, carrying coats at a gala, memorizing shipping routes nobody would ever thank her for, signing away her name to a company that had never once valued her, and felt, for the first time in 31 years, an almost unbearable distance between that version of herself and the one sitting here now. "It's strange," she said quietly.
I spent my whole life believing that if I just endured enough, worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, I'd eventually become someone worth loving. And it turns out the moment I stopped trying to earn it, I already had it. I just never noticed. Gabriel reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. I noticed the second I saw you, he said. Long before any of this. You were the only person in that world who never once asked me what I could give her. He opened the leather folder resting on his lap and handed her the final document inside, a court filing, freshly stamped, its language dense with legal terminology that had become almost familiar to her over the past week. She scanned it slowly, understanding settling in with each line. A permanent injunction, barring Beatrice, Julian, and Chloe Whitmore from holding any executive position, board seat, or ownership stake in any commercial logistics or shipping enterprise within the state, effective immediately and irrevocably, a direct consequence of the fraud judgment against them. It's over, Gabriel said quietly. Whatever they try to rebuild from here, it won't be in this industry, and it won't be under the name they used to hide behind for 31 years. Valerie set the document down on the small table between them, staring out at the darkening water, feeling something complicated settle in her chest. Not triumph exactly, and not quite peace either, but something steadier than either. Closure, maybe. The quiet, unglamorous kind that didn't announce itself with fireworks or headlines, just the simple absence of a weight she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Can I tell you something? She said after a long moment. That I haven't told anyone yet, not even Marco. Gabriel turned toward her, something attentive and immediate in his expression. Always. Valerie reached into the pocket of her linen jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Not a legal document this time, but something far smaller, something she'd been carrying since that morning, unable to decide when or how to bring it up amid everything else that had consumed the past week. She handed it to him without a word. Gabriel unfolded it slowly, and Valerie watched his face as he read it. A printed result from the small clinic she'd visited 2 mornings earlier, squeezed in quietly between legal briefings and press preparation, a private errand she'd told no one about because she hadn't been ready to say the words out loud until she understood them herself. His eyes lifted from the paper to meet hers, something raw and unguarded breaking across his features for the first time since she'd known him. A man who had spent his entire adult life mastering the art of revealing nothing to anyone, suddenly transparent in a way that made her breath catch. He started, and then stopped, as if saying it himself might make it disappear. 6 weeks, Valerie confirmed softly, watching the disbelief in his eyes shift slowly into something she'd never seen from him before. Not the calculated calm of a man who controlled empires, not the fierce protectiveness of a husband defending his wife, but something simpler and far more vulnerable. Wonder. A child, he said quietly, as though testing the shape of the word. Hours. Hours, Valerie repeated, and for the first time since the gala, since the tower lit up across the skyline, since marshals had sealed her past home and reporters had shouted questions across a crowded lobby, she felt tears finally rise to the surface. Not from grief or humiliation, but from something entirely new, something that felt, impossibly, like hope. Gabriel pulled her into his arms, careful and steady, the leather folder and its court documents forgotten on the table beside them, the last fading light of the sunset catching the ocean in soft, endless gold. Somewhere across the water, far beyond the horizon, the city continued turning without them, her family beginning whatever diminished, quiet life remained for them, the empire she now co-owned continuing its steady operations under capable hands that didn't need her supervision tonight. Here, on this quiet terrace, none of that mattered. For the first time in 31 years, Valerie Vance wasn't the ugly, obese one, wasn't the invisible daughter, wasn't the family's burden to hide at service exits. She was simply herself,
finally, completely, unapologetically seen, standing at the beginning of an entirely new story, with the man who had seen her all along, and the quiet, extraordinary promise of the life just beginning inside her.